I've hit it once.
Okay, all right.
Okay, there we go.
All right, so do you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a little bit of what I'm gonna cover and looking at the materials, which I'll go into variable detail, stone, ceramics, and then wood, and then bottles and cans in a relatively more recent sort of situation. So a lot of the research in recent years that I found interesting related to the beer, the origins of beer, is directly related to these questions about the origins of agriculture generally. So agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, occurred more than once. It occurred in different times and places in the past around the globe, with people experimenting with different species of flora and fauna. In archaeology, this has been a focus of a lot of research. And so just throwing out some terms here. Many people may have heard the term Neolithic, which just literally means new stone. And this phrase, the Neolithic Revolution, was a phrase that came into use in the 1930s by an English archaeologist by the name of V. Gordon Childe. And he promoted this way of looking at this transition that occurred in the past from hunting and gathering to agriculture as being as significant for human history and evolution as the Industrial Revolution. And was interested in all the changes related to this shift in subsistence. The term Natufian is a archaeologically defined culture. There was never a group who referred to themselves as Natufians, but it refers to these recurring sites and artifacts that are very similar across a certain amount of time and space in part of what's shown here is the Fertile Crescent. This is an old idea that still has value and points out sort of the prime area for where agriculture probably started, at least in this part of the world. And the agriculture that started here involves things such as barley and wheat, which are important for beer, but other plant foods and domestication of things like sheep and goat as well. I'm going to talk about a site that is a pre-pottery Neolithic site, PPN. And this is sort of a confusing term for a lot of people, for students. Initially, the idea of the Neolithic was that agriculture came with certain equipment and practices, including ceramics. We now know that ceramics do not necessarily go hand in hand with agriculture, even though it may seem that they would be obviously useful in such situations. So what we have then is the advent of agriculture in this part of the world a few thousand years before people began to use ceramic technology. And just a little quick side trip on the beer or bread topic. This was a recent paper where they found remains from an archaeological site in northeastern Jordan, one of these Natufian sites that is possibly 14,600 years old, with evidence of bread. And so they found an really old piece of bread. They did some analysis to determine, they had 24 different pieces of charred food. And they analyzed this material and showed that these bread-like products had been made using a form of wheat and also a tuber of some sort. So right now, the question of which came first, beer or bread, they're pretty close to neck and neck as far as archaeological finds. So another recent big find related to the origins of beer comes from Israel, Rakafet Cave. And this is another Natufian site. And keep in mind, Natufians are actually hunter-gatherer people. So they are hunter-gatherers that appear to have made extensive use of plants and animals that would eventually become domesticated. So these sites are thought to be related to people who witnessed or brought on the transition to agriculture in this part of the world. And research done on looking at plant remains from sites, it's largely by comparing the plant morphology that's available and the size of seeds, differentiating between when do barley and wheat become domesticated and when are we looking at wild varieties, because wild varieties of these plants are still present in this part of the world today, which is how we know that's where they were originating. So this cave then gives us essentially the earliest archaeological evidence for cereal-based brewing. Both wheat and barley were used here by these hunter-gatherers, and they were using stone mortars and bowls to grind up the grain, potentially malt it, and also potentially heating it up in these containers or mixing it with water to create beer. So when I say beer, of course, we're not talking about something that's going to taste like what you would potentially buy in a liquor store today, but we are talking about an alcoholic beverage made from barley and wheat. So some of the things from the site, and additionally, they were using holes in the bedrock to grind material and cook foods in. Some of the analysis from the site shows at least 7 different plant taxa were being used, including wheat and barley. And again, this site is around 13,000 years old. Some other typical Natufian artifacts you see here. We see stone blades like this that would have been used in sickles, handles that would have been used to cut the tops of wheat plants off, right, when you're collecting the seeds. And also mortars, which have previously been hypothesized could have been part of the brewing process. So maybe not making large quantity at once, it may seem fairly inefficient, but nevertheless, the equipment is there to do it, and the analysis of the material from the site indicates that some of the grains were malted, which is more efficient for brewing. Let grains get wet, begin to germinate, then you halt that process and dry it, and you now have grain that is in a form where the starches or the conversion to sugar has begun, and it's sugar that yeast feeds on to make alcohol. So that's an important part of the brewing process. Another recent find that's been getting a lot of attention, and a lot of the excitement about this site is because the site is associated with hunter-gatherer peoples, but it shows things that have often been associated with sedentary agriculturalists. So for one thing, monumental architecture. And so our understanding of the Neolithic in Southwest Asia has changed very rapidly with some of these finds. Initially, people were looking in the southern Levant for the origins of agriculture. This later shifted to other parts sort of adjacent to the Fertile Crescent region. But now this map, and this is the location of the Göbekli Tepe site in present-day Turkey. It's this area between the headwaters of the Tigris here and Euphrates rivers, where archaeologists are now sort of zeroing in, and they think this is the best place to look for archaeological evidence of this transition to agriculture, at least in this part of the world. This is where we find the wild versions of barley and a couple different kinds of wheat, including einkorn and immer wheat. So the photo of this site here, you can see the monumental architecture. There are T-shaped pillars in a circle-like enclosure around 2 central pillars. The pillars are connected by walls and stone benches, and they're decorated with animal motifs. snakes, scorpions, boars, gazelle, but also human body parts like arms and hands. None of the plant and animal remains associated with the site are considered to be domesticated. But we do have some really large containers at this site. And so there is some chemical evidence that has been interpreted as evidence for beer brewing. Some suggest it isn't entirely conclusive yet, but you can identify beer and brewing in the archaeological record through certain kinds of artifacts and pots in particular contexts, but then also the chemical analysis of organic residues. And so there was some grayish black residue adhering to these, and these are large limestone, this is a meter stick here, large limestone basins. And so when that material was analyzed, it showed oxalate, which is an organic acid found in plants that can form on vessels during the steeping, mashing, and fermentation of grains such as barley and wheat. It's an issue that modern day brewers have to deal with because it forms this layer. It's also known as beer stone, and you have to clean it off your equipment regularly. Some of these containers could hold up to 160 liters. And so there's people are thinking this is very strong evidence that this was a site where people gathered, they feasted, and part of that feast may have been the consumption of an alcoholic beverage made from grain. So for a long time, this site in China held the record for oldest archaeological evidence for alcohol. And what was found here isn't specifically beer, but it does include grain, and it seems worth mentioning in this context. So the site of Jiahu dates to the early Chinese Neolithic. It's around 9,000 years old. And these ceramic jars here, and they're not all identical, but they have these high flaring necks and rims, and within several of these vessels, dried residue was found that was analyzed by Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. He is an archaeochemist, and he has done extensive research on ancient alcohol. And what they found, so they reconstructed the ingredients based on this analysis, and what seemed to have been present in a lot of these vessels was a drink made from wild grape, hawthorn, which is sort of like a crab apple, rice, which is a grain, although we usually talk about rice wine instead of beer, and honey. So McGovern, he referred to this kind of beverage as an extreme beverage, which is sort of humorous, or he also used the term Neolithic Grog, using the term grog very loosely here for just a mixture of things. There are a lot of examples of this kind of beverage in the ancient world in different times and places where people would make an alcoholic beverage based on what was at hand and potentially almost everything on hand. So this is kind of a hybrid, it's wine, mead, beer, all in one beverage essentially. And McGovern talks a lot also about how some of these beverages would have been flavored with things that might have also had analgesic or hallucinogenic properties, depending on when and where they're being used. So this this find is important within the sort of the history of beer alcohol more generally. It suggested that it probably tasted, this beverage tasted more like a modern aged Belgian ale or barley wine that would have been higher alcohol than sort of regular beer. And this is actually one of the drinks that was recreated by Dogfish Head Brewery in Maryland in cooperation with Patrick McGovern. In addition to rice, millet is another grain that was domesticated during the Neolithic period in China, and separate research from a different site looking at residues. They were able to reconstruct a 5,000-year-old recipe for beer that included millet and barley. Other interesting things about this site, it provides the oldest evidence for cultivated rice. So we again have this connection between early agriculture and early alcohol. And the site was perhaps the earliest site for a perhaps inebriated jam session. We have these very old flutes made from animal bone recovered from the site, which are sort of interesting to think about the implications there. Elsewhere in China, further south, there are pottery fragments confirmed to be about 20,000 years old, which are, as far as I know, the oldest known pottery in the world. So in this part of the world, ceramics predate agriculture by several thousand years. So we can assume that alcohol was valued based on its presence, and as you move forward in time in China, there is increasing evidence for the use of alcohol and specialized serving and drinking vessels, often made of metal, in prestigious contexts such as funerals or celebrations. And it seems that innovation in metallurgy in Bronze Age China was really motivated by the desire to show off at public gatherings and to serve people food and alcohol out of these large, fancy metal containers. So this map shows early urbanism. These are sites where, because of the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture was well underway, and it resulted in different practices of land use, and it led to more people living together in increasingly larger and more permanent settlements. And so particularly the city-states of Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer down here. There are many written documents from ancient Mesopotamia from the 3rd millennium BC onward that provide details about the role of beer and its importance in society. It was consumed daily, so it was kind of a regular thing to have, but it also was expected at special celebrations, feasts, banquets, those kinds of social events. Down here we have a Cuneiform Tablet, and so this is the area where we have the oldest writing known. This tablet is about 5,000 years old, and it lists the allocation of beer rations. This is from the ancient city-state of Uruk in present-day southern Iraq. And then here you have drawn, to sort of more easily make it out, different symbols that essentially use the vessel that beer was fermented in and served from, becomes the symbol for beer itself. So here's one of these symbols, and you can spot some others in different places here. This is one of the oldest depictions of beer, specifically its consumption. So what you see is the impression made using a seal. Seals became important for marking clay, mud, and wax to indicate ownership of property in ancient Mesopotamia. And what's depicted here, this is interpreted as two individuals that are drinking beer from this large vessel using straws. So the Sumerian beer process, brewing process, does not seem to have, they didn't have any sieving or allow time for sediments to settle out. And so beer would be made and then consumed very quickly, while fermentation was well underway, but still ongoing. So you would drink beer out of a large container. Here's another image here showing seated people with a bunch of straws sticking out of this serving vessel. So you would use a straw so you could get underneath the plant material floating on the surface on the top and drink from below. people used reeds as straws, but wealthy elites had straws made of metal, some of which might have been decorated with lapis lazuli. And it's kind of fun to think about the lung power involved with using something like this to drink beer out of a large container. This was not the situation for drinking. This wasn't sitting around taking dainty sips. People were really into it. So drinking was definitely a social activity. It was important at banquets. Guests were expected to become inebriated. But as I mentioned, beer was also a day-to-day beverage. It was a nutritious form of grain food to eat. Some beer was probably low in alcohol that was consumed on a more regular basis. And clean water was already an issue at this point in time. If you think about the city-states upriver from you, especially, and what they're doing in the river and where they get their water, and then you think about where you get your water, drinking a low alcohol beer throughout the day was a way to stay hydrated and avoid disease. So there are a lot of similarities between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia as far as beer and brewing. Egypt probably has the most abundant archaeological art historical record of beer. Brewing goes back to the pre-dynastic era, which started 5500 BC, so 7,500 years ago. We have written records, a lot of records attesting to the importance of beer in the early dynastic period, which started about 5,000 years ago. And these are some relatively recent discoveries, things that people, thought should be out there somewhere based on other kinds of evidence, but hadn't really come up with yet. So over the last several years, we have this find, and this is relatively recently. This was going around the internet recently. A 5,000-year-old large scale, they were referring to it as basically industrial scale brewery found at a funerary site in Abydos. And this setup, which you only see part of it here, we're looking down on ceramic vessels that were essentially installed. And you can see some clay that would have been dried out to hold these things in place. But they're estimating about 5,900 gallons could have been made at a single time. This would be enough to give, if you had a stadium, a sports stadium with 40,000 people, that would be enough beer to give everyone in that stadium a pint of beer. This brewery probably dates to the time of Narmer, who ruled Egypt around 3150 BC and is known as the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single empire. This brewery has 8 separate large areas for beer production, each of which have about 40 ceramic pots in rows that many workers would have been involved with moving grain and water and making beer here. These other images are from another large brewery at Hierakonpolis, and this is a pre-dynastic site, so this one is about 600 years older than Abydos, so we have this long tradition of beer making here. At both of these sites, you have lots of large ceramic vessels that would have been all in use at once to make a large quantity of beer for feasts. These would have been sponsored by leaders, by the pharaoh or other leaders. This beer has a relatively short shelf life of just a few days, a week max. So in order to provide a lot of beer on a single occasion, you have to make a lot of it at once. You can't make it in advance and save it up for a long period of time. And we see in Egypt, as in Mesopotamia, the ability for leaders to provide beer at feasts was a sign of their competence in governing, essentially. If they can't organize and produce this, then people might wonder why they're bothering to contribute to what's going on. Other evidence, not with making beer, well, some of this is making beer, but drinking it. The beer made in Egypt was made using barley and or wheat. It was consumed by everyone in Egypt, regardless of class or gender. Grain was a common way of paying wages. This is not a cash or market economy. Or wages could be paid as beer or bread. There's a lot of evidence of beer from tombs, which is what you see here, which also suggests a link between beer and religion and the importance of beer, not just in life, but also the afterlife. This is a funerary model. These were included in the burials of elite people, and with the idea that whatever was going on in the model, in the afterlife, this activity then would be conducted for you. So these people would be making beer for you in the afterlife. And here we have some, these are sort of typical beer jars in red with a like clay top put over it. You see similar kinds of things up here. And this woman of elite status, this is a tomb wall painting, is being served beer out of a similar sort of beer jar container. This model is about 4,000 years old. All right, so I don't have a lot about TCHA, but I needed to mention this. This is ancient brewing in the Americas. The origins of agriculture in the Andes goes back at least 4,500 years. And TCHA, which is made from corn, has been identified archaeologically at a number of places based on the presence of fermentation vessels, also preserved hora, which is malted corn, and other artistic representations. There's a lot of evidence from the Moche Valley, which dates to around AD 200 for the importance of chicha or corn beer. When the Spanish arrived in South America, they referred to all sorts of beverages they found there as chicha, whether they were fermented or not. Today, there are a variety of different kinds of alcoholic chicha, but the best known and most popular is that made from maize or corn. This beer jug in Arevalo is associated with the Incan Empire. Archaeologists believe because of the distribution of these, the context that they were used for beer. Again, we have a nice tall neck, so liquids aren't going to spill out easily. And residue analysis has confirmed many of these contained corn chicha. In the Andes, ancient Andes, and more recently, being able to host a feast and serve chicha was important. Leaders were expected to do that sort of thing. And the distribution of Arevalo across a large area, some have interpreted as sort of a strategy on the part of the Incan Empire to provide a particular source of cohesion and identity focused around making and drinking chicha. All right, I'm going to make a big jump here. Oh, and these are drinking vessels. This is what people would have consumed chicha out of. I look at this rim and I think of a inebriated person drinking chicha from this, and I just imagine chicha going all over the place, basically. But okay, so jumping back over to Europe. Going to talk about the Celts for just a little bit. The Celts were a collection of tribes that originated in Central Europe, similar language, religious beliefs, and culture. They were around during what's known as the Iron or Bronze Age in Europe, depending on where you are specifically, and were present and identified as such up until the Middle Ages. The Greeks and Romans in Southern Europe referred to the Celts as barbarians. The Celts themselves left no written records, but we have a lot of historical references about them in Greek and Roman sources. And from this, we understand that beer was a staple in their daily diet. It would be consumed throughout the day. We have archaeological evidence, beer residue from a metal cauldron in Germany, as well as evidence for malting of barley. It's possible that their reliance on wooden vessels instead of ceramics may be why we have relatively less evidence of alcohol use than we do for other times and places in the past. Wood is less likely to survive than ceramics in most kinds of situations, but it also could be, you know, dependent on whether people are looking for this evidence or not. It is believed that the wooden barrel was most likely innovated by the Celts sometime during the first few centuries BC. The Celts lived where wood resources were plentiful, much more abundant than clays for ceramics, and they were able to make watertight barrel-shaped containers during this time period. We have other kinds of artifacts and evidence. And so in just the term barrel, in the UK, cask is the generic term for such a vessel, and they use the term barrel to refer to a specific size and shape that's used for beer. In the US, barrel is the more generic term for pretty much any and all cylindrical wooden containers. So it's thought that this technology probably developed from the previous use of open top wooden buckets or tubs with straight sides. And we even have some depictions of that kind of thing from ancient Egypt that's up to 5,000 years old, but we don't see in Egypt the development of an actual barrel, a closed container. The Romans began to use barrels. They were probably getting this technology from the Celts. They referred to barrels as kupa. And they started to use these instead of ceramic vessels as shipping containers. So they were used to hold wine and olive oil in the northern parts of the Roman Empire. Compared to ceramics, the barrels were lighter, easier to transport, and less easily broken. And we have archaeological finds from what was the Roman province of Germania that indicate wooden barrels, casks, and pails were all used for beer and brewing. So for nearly 2,000 years, barrels were the most convenient form of shipping and storage container, and were used for both wet and dry goods. Barrels would eventually fall out of use for shipping in the 20th century with the introduction of pallet-based logistics and containerization. The transition from wooden to metal kegs for beer in the US began in the 1930s, although barrels, of course, continue to be important for aging wine and spirits, and in recent years have experienced renewed popularity in craft brewing as well. So finally, shifting to something a little more local, there have been many different ways of making many different kinds of beer, but the basics of brewing have always been the same. You have to you convert starch in grain to sugar, and that's what yeast feeds on, and you involve water in this process somehow, often soaking and or boiling, and then you let this concoction ferment. The use of wooden kegs in the brewing industry over a 2,000-year period created even more stability in this process. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the early days of beer in the U.S. Beer has been brewed in America since the earliest European settlements, but it wasn't until the mid-1800s that the production of beer really accelerated. And so beer never stopped being important for social and celebratory situations, but where people drink began to change, and that affected technology, or you could say was affected by technology. So bars and pubs are still important, but by the mid-20th century, people were drinking more beer at home. Which led to or resulted from, depended on the timing of specific innovations, in beer packaging. One such change, and so over here on the right, this was an object from the TCHA collection. Shows it's not part of it is broken off, but this is a Hutchinson stopper. So the American public's response to lager beer, coupled with technological advances in refrigeration and pasteurization, led to an increase in beer production and the number of breweries. Technologies also allowed for beer now to be shipped to all different parts of the US where it wasn't possible before. when bottled beer became a feasible commercial option for breweries after pasteurization was perfected in 1875, a lot of bottling plants, a lot of breweries started their own bottling plant, and many sold carbonated beverages in addition to beer once they had the bottling plant in place. So the Hutchinson stopper was used for beer and other carbonated beverages. It was patented in 1879. It became very popular in the 1880s and 1890s. So returnable soda bottles then became common after the invention of the Hutchinson stopper. And they were considered the legal property of the bottler, and customers were required to return them to the bottler for refilling. But it's kind of interesting to consider how often that happened. But you see from this side view here sort of how the stopper would work. Could just be pushed down into the bottle and could consume the contents without the stopper coming out and you accidentally swallowing it. Here's a variety of stopper patents in the 1880s. A lot of innovation going on with packaging what was essentially single servings of beer. And then again, this bottle is from R.A. Howell of Lafayette, he opened a bottling works in 1881, and they bottled beer and soft drinks both. So after bottling, one of the next big innovations was cans. And I'm not going to provide a whole lot of details about cans in general. I just have this one example. But on the left, you see a journal article from the Journal of Historical Archaeology from 1993. And I just wanted to point this out. Beer Cans, a Guide for the Archaeologist. Most archaeologists in North America do not work in universities, but are instead employed by state and federal agencies and private consulting firms, where they are tasked with ensuring compliance with legislation that protects cultural resources. And so this kind of work, you know, you don't choose where to do your research, the project chooses you. And in this kind of work, archaeologists are often conducting surveys and excavations in places where they are as likely to encounter historic or more recent modern material as they are arrowheads. Which is what the public assumes archaeologists are always finding. But it's still important to get as precise dating information as possible with this kind of work. And so there have been many studies of 19th and 20th century consumer packaging, either by archaeologists or by others, and then used by archaeologists. The idea for putting beer in cans goes back to 1909, but ordinary tin cans at that time were designed to withstand internal pressure of only between 24 and 35 psi. The pasteurization process used on beer creates pressures of 80 psi. So a more sturdy can needed to be designed for this innovation to take off. And what you see is an example of a cone top can. Cone top cans were first manufactured by the Continental Can Company and were trademarked cap sealed. They were marketed in 1935 by the Schlitz Brewing Company of Milwaukee. And it was thought that with the popularity of bottled beer, that the bottle shaped cans would be more acceptable to beer drinkers. But also, these shapes of cans could be more easily filled on existing bottling lines because they're more similar to the size and shape of bottles. So as a result, a lot of smaller breweries used cone top cans. And by 1939, there were 102 breweries in the US using them, only one of which was a really big company, and that was, again, Schlitz. So this example in particular, Ye Tavern beer, some of you already know this history well, I'm sure. Team and Wagner Brewing Company was founded in 1863 by Frederick August team and John Wagner. Both were German immigrants. In its heyday, the brewery produced about 100,000 barrels of beer annually, which at that time made it the sixth largest in the state. The brewery lasted until Prohibition in 1918. The company existed making non-alcoholic products for a while. When Prohibition was repealed, something called the Lafayette Brewing Incorporated moved into the old Team and Wagner brewery, and they began brewing their version of what was one of Team and Wagner's popular styles, this Ye Tavern beer. And so that's what you're seeing here. Ye Tavern beer. The Lafayette Brewery Incorporated closed down around 1940. But this beer was then the inspiration for People's Brewing Company's Old Tavern beer, which they started brewing a few years ago. So that's my whirlwind tour of beer and brewing. There's my email. Feel free to give me an email if you have any comments or questions, or I'd be happy to answer any questions, or at least try to answer any questions you have right now.
Kory, I've got a question that kind of goes back to the fundamentals. It makes sense to me that fruit-based alcohol would kind of evolve naturally from just the fruit juice and fermenting. Grain-based alcohol, who was going to look at saying that there's a bunch of seeds rotting in this vat, let's drink this? Did wine precede grain-based alcohol?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that I talk about in the Archaeology of Beer class, of course, the idea that making alcohol from grain involves a series of steps. You can only get so far with an accident that might pique your curiosity. Most likely the oldest alcohol was what we call mead and was just made with fermented honey. There's not a lot you have to do to honey to get it to turn into alcohol. Nowadays, home brewers can make mead by buying honey, and then you mix it with water and you add in yeast, but honey on its own will turn into alcohol. And so, but it's not something there's archaeological evidence for or likely ever will be. Wine question, I'm a little out of date with how old wine is. Grape wine specifically, I think some of the evidence in the area of Armenia and the Caucasus goes back, present day Georgia, goes back several thousand years, possibly, I may get this wrong, but possibly back as far as like 9,000. And so that's what's interesting about the beverage from the site in China, is that people are using a variety of fermentables to make alcohol. But the idea is, how were people using grains? And we have evidence now of this really old bread, which was interesting. But another way to consume grains is to basically make sort of a gruel, right? People could mix it with hot water, and from there, then you potentially would get the accident whereby people might discover that it was fermentable. And if you let that sit, it gets bubbly and fermentation starts. So there could have been a alcoholic version of what was essentially oatmeal too, potentially as a step along the way of figuring out beer.
Interesting. Thanks. If nobody else is, I do have a quick question that relates to your metallurgical background. When they started producing cans, again, I'm thinking over in Great Britain, one of the problems they had was the solder that they used was a lead-based solder. It would oftentimes, especially with acidic foods, would leach the lead out into the food product. Was that a similar sort of thing when they started putting beer, which is also acidic, in cans?
Yeah, that's not something I know a whole lot about, but I do know there was a lot of effort in, so it wasn't just a matter of coming up with a can. All of the early cans had specific types of linings. I mean, today, have a lining of sorts, in that, you know, people have given thought and engineered specific types of cans so that the contents do not pick up flavors from the packaging or what have you. There were some of the experiments were, they seem, to my mind, rather costly, like different kinds of enameling the interior of cans. That was one thing that was tried, or pitching them essentially, which is something that happens or once happened with kegs. You know, wooden kegs, for instance, might be pitched, which doesn't necessarily mean literally like some really strong tree resins with pitch, but some sort of gooey, sticky substance that would adhere to the container and hopefully not give too much flavor to what you were putting in the container.
Mhm. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Anyone else have any questions? There's a few of you that are muted, so if you want to ask a question, just feel free to unmute.
Just say thanks. That was very interesting.
Was.
Well, you're most welcome. Glad
Yep.
you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Kory. We just really appreciate you taking the time to do this. We did record it, so we will get it
Great.
posted. Thank you.
Great,
Thank you,
super,
Kory.
thanks.
Kory, good job.